Hello and welcome to Thinking Aloud. I'm your host, Michael Wilson, and I am so excited about this current series that we're doing entitled Things That Make Me Go Hmmm. They're controversial topics, but I tried to throw in some thought provoking questions that will help us think through some issues. So, for those of you that are new to this show, again, I would love it if you would hit like or subscribe. But for those that are new, we call this thinking aloud because I believe that far too many Christians don't think. We're not encouraged to think. We're not taught to think. We are just, whenever we come up with certain questions, we're just simply told, well, the Bible says. But we have to be able to critically think through some of these issues. And so I wanted to do a series called Things That Make Me Go because I have some things that I just think need to be thought through. And so if you've missed any episodes, which this is the second one, so if you missed the first one, you can go back and watch that one. But tonight, I want to get into John chapter 8 and the story of the woman caught in adultery. Now, full disclaimer, if you are a serious student of the Bible, then you will know that this story is not in the earliest of manuscripts, and most of your Bibles will have that in a footnote. But I do see and believe that this is very well something Jesus could have said, or this story very well could have happened. It doesn't bother me that it's not in the early manuscripts, because I believe, again, this is definitely something that I can see Jesus doing. But I want to put a twist on it tonight. I want to give you some thought-provoking questions that might help us with this story. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with this story, in John chapter 8, Jesus is doing some teaching, and there is a woman that is brought to him by the Pharisees, by the religious leaders. And this woman has been caught in the very act of adultery. Now, under Jewish law, under the Mosaic law at that time, a man or a woman that was caught in adultery, that was or had been found guilty of adultery, that was a capital offense. They could die. They were to be stoned to death. And this woman, caught in the act of adultery, is brought before Jesus, and the religious leaders want to know, Jesus, what do we do with this woman? The law of Moses, they knew that the law of Moses said that she was to be stoned. But this was a test. If Jesus had said, well, stone her, then everything he had taught about compassion and loving your enemies and all of that, well, that could have come into question. But on the other hand, if he disregarded the law of Moses, then he could have been tried and convicted himself for blasphemy because he was going against the law of Moses. Now, before we get into some of my questions about this story, one of the things that makes me go, is where was the man? Because it takes two people to commit adultery. Why wasn't the man brought? We don't know. The story doesn't say. Did the man run off? That's a possibility. Another possibility is that the Pharisees possibly set this woman up. That's a possibility, that they wanted to trap Jesus, and so they set this whole thing up to catch her in the act and to bring her before Jesus. Women in that day were not they were property. They didn't have any real value other than bearing children. And if they couldn't produce a male child, a son, then they were considered cursed, and they weren't anything to their husbands. They did not marry for love back then like we do now. It was totally different. But Jesus did more to elevate the status of women than anybody else in the Bible. He brought women up to their rightful status. So we have this woman being dragged through the streets to Jesus. She could have been half clothed. We don't know. Again, the story doesn't say. But the story says that this woman was brought to Jesus, and the Pharisees wanted to know what Jesus thought that they should do with her, because according to the law, she deserved to be stoned. And it says that Jesus bent down and he wrote in the dust, and we're not told what he wrote. That would be an amazing piece of the story if we were given what Jesus wrote in the ground. But we're not told that. What we are told, though, is that Jesus says to the crowd that are ready to stone her, they've got stones in their hands ready to stone this woman. Jesus says to them, well, you who are without sin, you go ahead and cast the first stone. And the story goes, and again, you can read this in John chapter 8, that the whole crowd began to drop their stones and walk away, beginning with the oldest, probably because they realized that they had sin in their life. And then the younger folks probably just followed suit. What I think we had going on here was a herd mentality, a crowd mentality that, anytime you get people in a frenzy, it's easy to get everybody in a frenzy. And before you know it, people are doing things that they may not have normally done. But once all of them had left, Jesus looks at the woman and says to the woman, "Woman, where are your accusers? Where are they that condemn you?" And the woman looks around and she says, they're gone. I don't know. And this is the part of the story that I love, and this is the part that I can see Jesus doing. And Jesus looks at her and says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." Now, most Christians, when they talk about this story, we tend to talk about how Jesus didn't condemn her, but we put a lot of emphasis on the issue of go and sin no more. I think that's important. Of course, it's important because Jesus said it. But I want to focus more on the idea of Jesus not condemning her. Because if anybody had a right to, it was Jesus. Jesus had every right in the world to condemn this lady. Jesus had every right because he was God. He's the one that gave the Mosaic law. He had the right to condemn her and stone her, but he didn't. Now, why didn't he do that? Well, one, maybe he knew it was a trap. Maybe he knew that she had been set up. That's a possibility. Or maybe it's because Jesus isn't looking to condemn people. He's wanting to free them from their life of sin. She got mercy. She got what she didn't deserve. She deserved death according to their law, but she got mercy. And the way that we see God determines how we're going to treat other people. And oftentimes we expect God to bring the hammer down on us. And so we oftentimes will want to bring the hammer down on other people. But Jesus gave her mercy and he said, "I'm not going to condemn you." And yes, he does tell her to go and sin no more. But I believe that's a freeing statement. I believe that he's showing her who she really is to him, that she's valuable, that she's worth something, and that she doesn't have to live that lifestyle anymore. So it was very controversial for Jesus to do what he did. And in our day and age, we don't look at adultery the same way. For one, adultery is not a capital offense. And a lot of us have gotten so used to people committing adultery that we still look down upon it, we frown upon it, we still think it's a bad thing. But in their society, you could die. And in our society, people just get divorced, or sometimes they stay together and they work through it. But a lot of times it just ends the marriage and people move on. It hurts, but I don't think we take it as seriously as what Jesus did. As a matter of fact, in our country, adultery used to be, and maybe it's still on the books, but it used to be punishable. It was a crime. Nowadays, I don't know that it's so much a crime, or if it's on the books, it never really does get prosecuted. So what makes me go, about this story? Well, let's change the narrative up a little bit. What would happen, or what would have happened, had the person that was brought to Jesus, what would have happened if they would have been a drug addict or an alcoholic? Would Jesus have still said, "I don't condemn you"? Would he still have said, "You who are without sin, you cast the first stone"? See, the one thing that I know about people is it is easy for us to condemn others. Especially, it is very easy for us to condemn people that sin differently than we do. So if I'm not committing adultery, it's easy for me to condemn someone that's committed adultery. Or if you've been cheated on, if adultery's been committed against you, maybe you had a spouse or a significant other cheat on you, and it's real easy for you to judge others that have done the same thing. But notice in this story that Jesus doesn't say, "You who have never committed adultery, cast the first stone." He doesn't say, "You who have never had a lustful thought." Jesus says, "You who are without sin." And let's face it, we've all sinned. We've all messed up. We've all done things that we shouldn't do. We've all done things we know we ought not have done. But what would have happened if what would have happened if a drug addict or an alcoholic was brought to Jesus? Now, back then, they probably didn't have drug addicts. I'm sure they had alcoholics, but they didn't have drug addicts, or at least we don't know of that they did. Maybe they did. But nowadays, that's a thing that we deal with. People deal with drug addictions, people deal with alcoholism, and it destroys lives. What would have happened had a drug addict or an alcoholic been brought to Jesus? Because many times the church, unfortunately, we've been willing to condemn people for drug addiction or alcoholism. We've been willing to look down our noses at them. As a matter of fact, one of the things that aggravates me so much is that you take a Hollywood actor or a musician that is a drug addict or an alcoholic, and we don't think too much about it. We'll sing their praises, we'll still listen to their music, we'll go and watch their movies and still treat them like a celebrity. But you take just a normal, ordinary person that's a drug addict or an alcoholic, and then suddenly they're a crackhead or a meth head or, a drug addict or whatever. They suddenly become less than human. And so we pick up our rocks and we're ready to throw them at the person that we're condemning. But would Jesus have done that? Would Jesus have looked at them and said, "I don't condemn you either, go and sin no more"? I personally believe that he would have. I believe that Jesus was not in the condemning business, but he would have said the same thing to a drug addict. But let's take it one step further. What about a drug dealer? Somebody that's peddling this stuff to people, somebody that's getting them addicted, somebody that's making money off of other people's misery. Would Jesus have said the same thing? Would Jesus have looked at them and said, "Neither do I condemn you, go and sin no more"? See, what we need to realize is that this adultery, again, was a capital offense. She could have died for it. She should have been stoned for it according to the law. So she broke the law. She was a felon, a capital felon, if you will. Well, a drug dealer would be the same thing. It would be the same thing in our society. Somebody that's broken the law, somebody that deserves to go to jail, somebody that deserves to be punished. And yet, seemingly, Jesus lets her off the hook and lets her go and tells her, "Go and sin no more." Now, again, I don't believe that Jesus is in the condemning business. I believe that he's in the saving business. And I believe that by him telling her, "Go and sin no more," that he was giving her a way out. He was giving her freedom if she would take it. Would he do the same thing with a drug dealer? Maybe. I believe he would. But again, each of us, we have to kind of look at this and ask ourselves the same question. Put yourself in the crowd. What would you have done? Now, in that society, you probably would have been ready to stone her. But let's take the adultery issue out of the way and let's make it something that we deal with. Again, a drug dealer. What would you do? Especially if this drug dealer was one that was supplying your child with drugs. Would you be offended if Jesus looked at them and said, "Neither do I condemn you, go and sin no more"? Well, let's take it a step further. What about a thief? Somebody that steals, somebody that robs other people, somebody that takes things that don't belong to them, somebody that's taken from you, and you bring him to Jesus and you're ready to stone him. And Jesus looks at him and says, "Go and sin no more. I don't condemn you." And if that was us, maybe we're disgusted. Because see, here's the thing with Jesus. Jesus doesn't go by our opinion. We have to go by his. He doesn't ask what we want to do or what we feel like should be done. He does what he wants to do. And his desire is to save people, to love people. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not consequences or there shouldn't be consequences. In this particular case with this woman, she did get out of it without any consequences. I'm not saying that God will always get you out of the consequences. If I go out here and I drink and I drive and I have a wreck, I still can go to jail for drunk driving. Now, maybe God will have mercy on me and I can get out of it, but what if I kill someone? Do I need to go to jail? Yes, according to the law, I should be punished for what I did, but that's not God punishing me. That's my own sin punishing me. And in this instance with the woman, her own sin would have punished her, but for some reason, Jesus decides to let her off. Let's take it a step further. What if the person brought to Jesus was a murderer? What if they had murdered your son or your daughter or a family member? And Jesus looks at them and says, "You who are without sin, you cast the first stone." And we might rise up and say, "But Jesus, I've never murdered anybody." But I'm reminded of what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, that if you hate your brother, if you hate someone, you're the same as a murderer. Because when you live with that kind of hate, that where you detest somebody, you might as well wish they were dead, because you have no regard for their well-being. You don't care if they live or they die. As a matter of fact, in some cases, you would rather that they be dead. Jesus says that's the same as a murderer. But we don't see it that way. We see that somebody that kills somebody, well, that's terrible. And it is. I'm not making light of that. But Jesus takes everything a step further and says that the way that we feel about others, when we don't act in love, when we act in hate, where we detest someone, that's the same as murdering them. Let's just take this one step further, shall we? Because again, these are things that just make me go, things that I think about. What if the person caught that was brought to Jesus was a pedophile? Now, again, that's something I would struggle with. Somebody that hurt children. And I'm reminded of what Jesus said about people that hurt children. It would be better for them to have a millstone hung around their neck and be cast into the sea than to hurt a little one. So again, would Jesus have put the millstone around that person's neck and told everybody to go ahead and stone them? Or would Jesus say, "You who are without sin, you cast the first stone"? And many of us, all of us would say, "But I've never done that to a child. I'm not a pedophile." That's, in our society, that's about as low as you can get. That's about the lowest thing that you can do, is hurt a child sexually, to molest a child. And we have laws against that, and for good reason. We need to protect our children. But what would we do if Jesus had looked at a pedophile and said, "I'm not going to condemn you either, go and sin no more"? I think most of us would have a real struggle with that. And yet, what we have to realize is that Jesus took that person's sin unto himself and died on the cross, even for the pedophile. For the most hideous thing that we can think of, Jesus went to the cross for that sin. Not only did he go to the cross, but the Bible says that Jesus became our sin. He who knew no sin became our sin, even the sin of the pedophile. Well, let's just take this one step further. And again, I'm not saying that these are different degrees, because what I'm going to ask next really has to do with your view. And some of you, what I'm about to say, the next two cases that I'm about to bring up, some of you as Christians, you don't see anything wrong with it. And I'm not here to debate whether it's right or wrong. I'm just throwing out some thought-provoking questions. These next two would be for those Christians that do see this as wrong. So here's the question. What if the person brought to Jesus was a homosexual or a lesbian? Now, again, some Christians, we're like, well, why would they bring that person to Jesus? Well, in that culture, certainly it was a sin. And in our culture, some Christians view it as a sin. And again, I'm not here to debate that. That's not my point. My point, though, is what would Jesus do? I know what some of us would do, again, because some Christians find it very abominable. Some Christians find it very disgusting. Some Christians find it very hard. Some Christians believe it's a deathly sin. Other Christians are okay with it. I mean, that's the debate that's going on in the church right now: is it a sin? Is it not a sin? And again, I'm not here to debate that. That's not my point. My point is, you who are without sin, you cast the first stone. So what would we do if we were in the crowd? For those that think it's wrong, you'd be like, well, I'm not a homosexual, I'm not a lesbian. And you might even point to an Old Testament passage. But that's what the Pharisees were doing. They were pointing to an Old Testament passage that literally said she deserved the death penalty. What would Jesus do? Well, let's take it another step. What if the person was transgender or considered themselves non-binary? And again, I'm not here to debate whether that's a sin or not a sin. That is not the point of this episode. And I know that even me not saying yes or no angers some people. And they'd be like, well, you need to come out and tell us what you say, what you think. And no, I don't, because that's not the point of what I'm doing here. And so don't walk away saying, well, he's for it, because I didn't say I was, but don't walk away and say he's totally against it because I didn't say that either. I'm saying, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus do today, in today's society, if he was here physically and a transgendered person was brought to him? And again, I know a lot of the people in the church would be the ones to bring that person to Jesus and throw that person down at Jesus's feet and say, we need to stone him. We need to put this person to death. They deserve death. And would Jesus still say, you who are without sin, cast the first stone? Again, I don't want to put words in Jesus's mouth. I don't want to say what Jesus would or wouldn't do. I'm simply here asking questions because I think about these things. And these are things that make me go, what would Jesus do? Because this is what you and I are dealing with as Christians now. These are things that we're dealing with in the church. And if we are Christ's body in the world, we have to learn how to act like our master, like Jesus would have us to act. Well, let's just really step out on a limb here. What if it was Hitler that was brought to Jesus? What if it was a serial killer or somebody as crazy as Hitler? Somebody that tried to exterminate an entire race of people, not just an entire race of people, but the very people that Jesus came from. What would Jesus do? Would Jesus look at him and say, well, first of all, would he look at us and say, you who are without sin, cast the first stone? And I can tell you, this is one that I really would have trouble with. Because in my mind, I would be thinking, Jesus, I didn't kill 6 million Jews. Jesus, I didn't try to wipe out an entire race of people. But yet again, if I've hated anyone, I'm the same as a murderer. Yeah, but I didn't hate 6 million people. I would struggle with this one. I don't know that I would drop my rocks so fast. I might sit there and try to bargain with Jesus. I don't know. I'm just saying, for me, this one would be a struggle, especially if Jesus would look at him and say, I don't condemn you either. Go and sin no more. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, I wouldn't struggle with that. Jesus doesn't condemn anybody. And I do believe that Jesus doesn't condemn us. But at the same time, I would be lying if I didn't tell you that there's times when I look for God to condemn certain people. But usually, well, not usually, always. It's always people that sin differently than I do. But I do know this. I know as bad as what Hitler did, and Hitler was atrocious. What he did was atrocious. It is unthinkable, unimaginable that anybody would do that. And he's not the only person in history that's ever committed such atrocities. The greatest atrocity, in my opinion, is when the Jews and the Romans collided together to crucify Jesus. When the religious leaders consorted with Pontius Pilate and they had Jesus crucified. They killed God. And our belief as Christians, they killed God. And yet Jesus on the cross looks at them committing the greatest atrocity that's ever been committed. And Jesus cries out to the Father, Father, forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing. Wow. So Jesus is now the one that's being thrown down before the leaders. And basically they're saying, what do we do with this man? And they said he deserves to die. And they killed him. They, in essence, did not drop their stones. They didn't literally throw stones at Jesus, but metaphorically they did. They threw their stones at Jesus. And Jesus was willing to forgive them. So if Jesus is willing to do that, then is it possible that every single person that I mentioned, Jesus would have looked at them and said, you who are without sin, cast the first stone, to the crowd, but then to the person, where are your accusers? So let me just take this one last step. What about if it was you that was thrown down before Jesus? Or what if it was me? Now, I haven't committed the sins of Hitler, but I'm no saint either when it comes to being sinless. I've done some dumb things in my life. I've done some things I'm not proud of. I've hurt some people in my life by things I've said, by things I've done, by things I've left undone. You know, I'm not perfect by any means. I've got sin in my life, or had sin in my life, done some things. Would Jesus have mercy on me? I believe he would. I believe he would look at me and say, Michael, I don't condemn you. Go and sin no more. I believe he would look at you and not condemn you. So if Jesus isn't going to condemn us, then what right do we have to condemn others? Oh, but they're sinful. They shouldn't be living that way. Well, neither should this woman. This woman was doing something that she shouldn't have been doing, and Jesus knew that. And yet he didn't condemn her. Now, am I saying that we can just go out here and live any way we want to and do whatever we want to do because Jesus isn't going to condemn us? Absolutely not. There is a right way to live and a wrong way to live, but what's the right way to live? Well, the right way to live is governed by love. Your love for God, your love for yourself, your love for others. So you shouldn't do anything that's not motivated by love. But at the same time, if you do mess up, we also need to know that Jesus is inviting us to come running to him, not run away from him because we're afraid he's going to condemn us. And that's the way I want us to live our lives as believers. I want people to run to us as believers. I want people to run to the church. I want people to be able to come to us, followers of Christ, when they've messed up, knowing that they're going to be loved and accepted and not condemned. And somewhere, yes, along the journey, they're going to be told, go and sin no more. But notice that Jesus didn't deal with her sin first. He dealt with her shame and condemnation. Maybe, just maybe, if the church dealt with that, if we took shame off of people and condemnation off of people first, rather than telling them how bad they are, or how sinful they are, or what they should stop doing, maybe people might start listening to us again. I don't know. That's something else that just makes me go, something to think about. You can check out my website, michaelwilson.org. I've got some blogs there. There's lots of other videos there that you can watch, past Thinking Aloud shows, some other sermons that I've done in the past. Would love for you to check that out. And again, if you would, please hit the like button, subscribe to this YouTube channel. We're going to be putting out more content as time goes by. I've got a few more episodes to do for this series called Things That Make Me Go Hmmm. And again, controversial topics, thought-provoking questions, because we know that thinking is allowed. Until next time, God bless.